no worries about it being a small auditorium. There are some trivia questions and stuff where we'll have you respond in the chat or open your mic and give us an answer if you've got one. So we'd love it if you participate, especially with such a small audience. Glad you guys could make it. It's going to be an hour. We've got 30 minutes and then we'll open up for Q&A. And I hope you guys really enjoy it. Just going to give it another minute for folks to come in. I'm also working with a new AV setup in my home office. So if you have trouble hearing me or I get any cutouts or anything like that, please let me know in the chat or open your mic so that I can adjust. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the presentation of our Reading Between the Lines training. This is called the Virtual Language Barrier. I'm Cody Gilkison, the DEI business partner for eXp Realty. And let's get right into it. So our agenda for today, first we're going to go over some terminology and background on what exactly we're talking about. Then we're going to dive into language bias. What is that? And then we're going to break down that breakdown and sort of figure out what it is and how we can combat it and why it's not so daunting of a task, even though it's something we all have just as part of our being in being a human being in society. Then we've got some example scenarios. We're going to go over cultural competence and how we can be better there, and then we'll open up for a Q&A at the end. Okay, so what are we even talking about? We're talking about how when native English speakers communicate with folks who speak English as a second language in a virtual workspace, particularly using typed text in an email or work chat message. So we already know that a language barrier exists when people are talking to each other with their voices, or even better, when we can see each other, right? But more often than not, in the workplace, we're talking via chat or email. So we're specifically talking about that language barrier breakdown. In these situations, we commonly misunderstand one another, and often it's not because of the words, but what we perceive as being behind the words, like context, subtext, or what we consider standard language or phrases that may not translate well or be part of the culture of the person we're speaking to. So often when somebody sends you a text message, are you just reading the words for what they're worth, or are you reading them colored with your knowledge of that person and your own personal baggage as to what you think it might mean, right? I think for the ladies in the room, when you get a text message from a guy and it just says, "Sup," there's a lot of different ways that could go depending on who the guy is. Am I right? So it's the same kind of thing in this scenario. So some terminology. These are words we're going to use a bunch during this. Native speakers. A native speaker is a person for whom a particular language is the one spoken by the majority in the community where they grew up. So that doesn't necessarily mean I grew up in America, so I speak English. There are folks who live in America that grow up in a Latino family. They grow up speaking Spanish with their family who speaks Spanish. They live in a community where primarily people speak Spanish. That person is a native Spanish speaker, right? It's the majority of the community where you grow up, not necessarily your nationality. ESL, that's our three-letter term for English as a second language. This is English, which is spoken by those who are native speakers of another primary or first language. So anyone who has a native tongue but learns English as a second language is an ESL speaker. Uh, Language barriers are features of language use that result in miscomprehension, miscommunication, or a complete loss in communication. And then we have this lovely image here. This was suggested by my partner in crime, Jessica Nieto. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And we're going to touch back on that comment later in the training. In today's world, ESL groups who migrate into English-speaking countries face language barriers which can and often do lead to discrimination and racism, right? We see this little sign here. It's funny, but somebody actually carried this sign in a protest. Respect our country, speak English. From someone who doesn't speak English very well, right? This thought that in order to respect the United States or someone from the United States, you need to get on our terms and speak our national language is discriminatory and predatory and unfortunate, you know? And whether we realize it or not, this type of racism is something that's been given a lot of room to grow and fester in our society, and it's something we each individually have to actively work to combat. In America, the first instance of this type of racist thought that often comes to our minds is regarding immigrants from across our southern border, but this is just as prevalent in the way we treat our virtual work colleagues from Asian countries like India, China, and the Philippines. That's really where we're headed today, is with our virtual work colleagues from Asia, viewing that this sort of racist thought that you need to speak our language in order for me to feel that interacting with you is appropriate. That's the same thing as anti-immigrant racism in America, right? We have to face these two things as equals and combat them all in the same swing of the bat. So we're going to confront our language bias. What language bias is it's the view that only the language we speak is proper and all other languages are lesser or in some way inappropriate. This type of bias is actually really counterintuitive, and it's easily broken down. Over the next few slides, we're going to poke holes in this bias. So if you've attended my unconscious bias training, or you know of unconscious bias, bias is not something that is necessarily a purposeful behavior, right? We often have biases that are part of the societal structure of where we grow up. And it's just a known fact, a given fact, that in America in particular, we have a major language bias that's built into us. We really do have a bias to look down on those that don't speak English, especially if how dare they speak a language other than English in our country or when interacting with us in a workplace in our country. Now, here's where we're going to really break this down. We're going to take each of these points one by one and really let them sink in, because these are some big tips that if you let your brain take this process every time you're interacting with someone that's speaking another language, can make the breakdowns less likely to occur. The first thing is, how easily could you pick up a new language if you had to? Think about not only learning some phrases to help you get by, like if you're a tourist, but being able to conversationally speak in the way that our ESL colleagues are required to. I know that thought of learning another language is really scary to me. That seems like one of the most daunting things you could ask me to do, right? Especially if we're talking about speaking conversationally. Because in the US, often we do take a second language in high school, but very few people would say that they walked away from those classes being fluent, right? That's a whole nother level of understanding. Next point, if you did learn a new language, wouldn't you consider that an impressive accomplishment? I put here, and this is dead true, this is me being honest with you, I would want a pizza and a trophy and a pay increase, right? If I learned another language, a whole nother language that I could fluently speak conversationally. Um, I think we'd agree all there. Then why wouldn't we think that about others? Think about the last time you had an ESL speaker on the other end of a customer phone call. Did you treat them with the respect you'd want to be treated with if you learned their language? Think about the last time you had a customer service phone call and someone with an Indian accent was on the other line. Do you think that you gave them the respect that they deserve as someone who did this massive undertaking of learning a language well enough to do their job with it? Think about the shoe being on the other foot, and you're an American working customer service for an Indian company, and a native Indian speaker calls you. If you had taken the time to learn their language, I bet you'd be filled with a lot of anxiety that you would get it wrong. I would bet that you would probably speak more plainly without a lot of flowery language. And I would bet that if someone didn't treat you kindly, that you would feel pretty offended by that, right? And you have every right to. So here's the next piece, tying all of that from the last slide together. Do we really believe that people born in countries or cultures where English isn't the primary language are automatically less educated than people born in primarily English-speaking countries or cultures? Because essentially that's what we're saying. That's when I say that language bias is easy to break down. Language bias is essentially taking that statement and saying, yes, I believe that people who don't speak English are automatically less educated, right? When in reality, other countries have education systems that are every bit as challenging, if not more challenging, than ours. Most countries teach multiple languages to their children and require fluency for a passing grade, right? We're nowhere close to that. There's a sort of American arrogance that goes with, well, English is the best language in the world, so that's the only one I need to learn, right? We should also reflect on whether we're just judging an entire people as less than because they're different from us, which is patently unhealthy. That's always unhealthy. I don't have to tell you why thinking an entire people is less than you is unhealthy. Also consider that most other countries teach multiple languages to their students. I already covered that. All right, lastly, given all that we learned in the past two slides, can we recognize the bias in the thinking that only people who were raised speaking English as their first language should be worthy of holding a job in the US? Right? We can look that right in the face and say, that's biased. We all can do that. Now, add another wrinkle onto that. Consider the global virtual workplace. At eXp, we pride ourselves on our virtual workplace, and a major source of that pride is the fact that we can operate globally in a way that brings us together in ways never seen before in work culture. We can be together in virtual spaces regardless of where we live, and that's a beautiful thing that none of us should hesitate to embrace. Working with folks from countries who don't speak English as a primary language should be seen as a privilege of global expansion. It's literally living out the dreams of our company's mission. And there's so much we can learn from one another. It also ensures that in many countries we operate, we're bringing the very best talent to the table, right? Because we have the tools at our disposal and the people who believe in the mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion enough to recognize that sometimes the best person for the job isn't a primary English speaker. Okay, therefore, it's up to us to diligently work to be respectful of those among us who are from different regions and backgrounds. That's why we're here. Yeah. When we opened our doors in Dubai, do you think we filled the top levels of talent based primarily with a first thing on the resume as English as a first language? No, we didn't do that. Right? We found the best people for the job. So when we're working with those people from our cushy seats here in the States, um, we should give them the respect that they deserve because eXp hires the best. Now, here's an example scenario. I want you to read this chat exchange. I'm going to read it to you, but we're going to talk about how it went. Okay, so we have a manager speaking to a employee who is a ESL speaker. The native English speaking manager says, "Hi there. I saw that on line 232 you marked the response agent error. However, this is incorrect. In this case, because the transaction coordinator automatically uploaded the file with the incorrect closing date, this would be a TC error. When looking at these, a quick rule of thumb is to check the audit trail and see what the comments are, the timestamp, and who left them. There are a few of these things that slip through the cracks. Could you review the work you've done for the day, given this new bit of information I've just given you? Let me know if you have any questions. Me or your lead should be able to assist, or you can highlight the line. We find that helpful. Then you can remember to tell us about your highlighted lines toward the end of the day." And the response from the ESL speaker, "Okay, sure." Anybody want to open up their mic and tell me what they think about this exchange? Or type it in the chat? Lots of big words. Yep. We have to recognize too that English is one of the trickiest languages to learn, primarily because we have so many words that sound exactly the same, and we have so many more words that mean the same thing, right? All these words for the same thing. Sounded like the manager was scolding the agent. Yeah, it comes up a little scoldy. A few idiomatic phrases that not be easily understood. That's a really good point. See a couple of you are still typing. Let's get our thoughts out before we move on. It's also bunched up. So if I was faced with that as an ESL person, all I would see is letters. That's so true. That's a big white brick of text, isn't it? Now, did you think the response, "Okay, sure," was a little snippy or rude? That's a lot of the feedback we got when we ran this past, folks. "Okay, sure." And why do you think we would think that is snippy or rude, right? Because we have the context of that as English speakers to read into the subtext there and think, "What, are you blowing me off? I just told you all of this and you don't have more questions about it?" But ESL speakers often only use the words necessary to convey what they mean. And shoe on the other foot, if you were speaking their language, wouldn't you also use the necessary words without a bunch of flowery extra? It's not like we're trying to prove a point that we speak English, right? I just said what I needed to say in order to get my job done. The context of this being snippy or rude wasn't there for the ESL speakers when they responded. They're saying those words at face value. Bonus points if you noticed the colloquial phrases and thought they might be problematic. So bonus points to Alex in the house. Good job for pointing that out. I think the term that was used in there, "slipped through the cracks." If you weren't an English speaker, you might spend a good few minutes going, "What is he talking about?" Um, and then another thing to point out here is that they also have an impulse to want to, and it's a correct impulse, to want to say something in response so that you don't think that they're ignoring you. So they said, okay, sure, to buy themselves time while they read through our giant run-on sentence over here, right? They need time to dissect all of this before they can come up with a response, but they don't want to seem like they're being rude by not responding right away. So that's also part of it. And this is something that this seems like an extreme example. It's not. Often when we as English native speakers are working with folks that speak another language, we don't like to interact with them. So we say everything we need to say in one go so that we can put them aside and move on. That sounds harsh, but it's real. And part of this is we have to start thinking about these folks as people of value who are a part of the team. And we're going to move on to the next. We've got the impact of this breakdown. This is what happens when we don't use that train of thought. Example number one, an Iraqi hotel worker in Phoenix filed a complaint with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, because his co-workers at the Four Points by Sheraton continuously mocked his accent and called him by derogatory names. Managers refused to take his complaint seriously, even though a hostile work environment had developed. Ultimately, he won a $500,000 settlement. In example two, according to these folks in 2012, they said that the U.S. General Accounting Office estimated that 10% of randomly sampled employers from a group of 461,000 employers, so we're talking about, what is that, 46,000 of these employers engaged in illegal discriminatory hiring practices based on a person's foreign appearance or accent. And that's just talking about the interactions that we're not covering today. That's talking about face-to-face when we can see someone, right? An example where a person went the other way. Rather than the typical ESL speaker who uses only the necessary words, an international student named Sarja Dasgupta recounts undergraduate experience when he first moved to the US and how he was consistently told that he uses too many redundant words that are hardly necessary. Why would you think he's doing that? Because that's what we do. That's a very native English trait. Because of his usage of unnecessary words, he was often deprived of postgraduate opportunities, attending speaking events, and had countless academic struggles in communication-centered classes. Now, whose problem is this? And then we've got I love this picture. Are you talking about me? We have a study here that sort of turns this back around on us, and we'll go into that. Jennifer Jenkins, a professor of global Englishes at the UK's University of Southampton, wrote that native speakers are at a disadvantage when you're in a lingua franca situation where English is being used as the common denominator. That's what lingua franca means. The English is the common denominator in a conversation. It's the native English speakers that are having difficulty understanding and making themselves understood. Let that one sink in. It's us that are having trouble making ourselves understood and understanding. ESL speakers genuinely use more limited vocabulary and simpler expressions without flowery language or slang. And because of that, they understand each other at face value, often in a quicker time as well. Jenkins found, for instance, that international students at her British university understood each other well in English and swiftly adapted to help the least fluent members in any group understand. Another prime example. A UK-based company experiences a huge financial loss following a miscommunication between an ESL speaker and a native speaker through work email. The email was written and sent by the native speaker to the ESL speaker, who used words that the recipient found held several contradictory meanings. Months later, senior management investigated why the project had flopped, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it all traced back to this one word. This UK-based communication skills and intercultural trainer who did the deep dive She also didn't reveal the tricky word because it's highly industry specific and possibly identifiable. But we're talking about one word. I think that we as English speakers often think that a word means something different when we're talking to each other, right? It's about the context and all of that business that an ESL speaker wouldn't have, and we do. Things spiraled out of control because both parties were thinking the opposite. When such misunderstandings happen, it's usually the native speakers who are to blame. Ironically, they are worse at delivering their message than people who speak English as a second or third language, according to Chong. A lot of native speakers are happy that English has become the world's global language. They feel they don't have to spend time learning another language, says Chong. But often, you have a boardroom full of people from different countries communicating in English and all understanding each other, and then suddenly the American or Brit walks into the room and nobody can understand them. Now we're going to break down the breakdown. We've got this 15-year-old named Priska, who in a study with Collaborative Future detailed her experience as an international student in the UK. First, she states that due to being an ESL speaker, she recounts feeling overwhelmed by a few things. The first being the overbearing need to please and thank at every possible instance, right? That's something that she would trip over constantly because it's hard, that's a difficult thing in the English language of when it's appropriate to please and thank. And if you miss one, somebody's going to jump all over you for it, right? That's a weird part of our language. Also, offensive translations of English phrases that are commonly used in the workplace. She particularly pointed out bite the bullet and take it with a grain of salt. She said those were confusing to dissect in English and would be read overall as problematic in her culture. Can you see where bite the bullet would be problematic? We're just going to bite the bullet and do something? In 2020, when people were pushed to work virtually, more of these types of phrases were being used more frequently and were more easy to misinterpret. The sort of folksy colloquialisms that we use in everyday language are something that we should avoid when we're talking to an ESL speaker. They don't know this. They don't know the background behind it. And honestly, if we dig into why we're saying what we're saying, it's often not the best way to illustrate our point. And then, according to Priska, hearing native speakers' tone of voice was crucial in her own understanding of the language. If it's crucial in understanding the language, then we have to recognize the difficulty when it's not there. Without having a direct voice behind these phrases, it becomes confusing in translation. Due to this, she responds to phrases such as the aforementioned ones with okay, all right, or got it. Then she gets told by her colleagues that her responses to their communication have been jarring and come off as sarcasm. Do you think she intended sarcasm with those responses? I think she meant, I don't understand why you're telling me to bite a bullet, but let's move on because I'd like to keep my job. Right? In response, Priska mentioned how difficult it is to understand the context of these phrases as it posed a barrier to her native understanding of such words, right? Then it becomes those individual words, bite the bullet, become confusing because that phrase is confusing. So let's talk about cultural competence. What can we do to be more inclusive and understanding of our ESL colleagues? First, be respectful of their cultural, geographical, and educational background. Always remind yourself of how difficult it would be for you to pick up their native language. Second, speak simply and try to avoid using slang or colloquial phrases, unless you intend to explain their meaning and how they're used by native English speakers. A good example of that would be, in America, we have this phrase, blah, 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 and we say this when, blah, 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 right? If you don't feel like explaining it, don't use it. Then we need to recognize that ESL speakers often have anxiety in speaking English with a native speaker, often due to unfair criticism of how the language should be used, and give them space to practice and hone their skills without judgment. And then fourth on this slide, be patient. It can be disheartening to be rushed to speak a language that isn't native to you, so give them time to review your words and appropriately formulate a response. We especially need to think about that if we feel the need to send a big block of text, right? Give them a minute to digest. This is an important one to me. Branch out and speak to ESL speakers more often to grow your understanding of them as people. This can make all the difference. Don't just talk to them about work. Treat them as you would a native English speaker. Try to learn some phrases in their native language. Ties back to our quote from the beginning, right? From Nelson Mandela. How do you think it would make them feel if you asked, how would you say this in Farsi, right? Or how would you say this in Chinese, right? That could go a long way to endearing yourself and then growing a sense of trust so that you have a better working relationship. Ask for clarification if you need it. If something someone says is confusing or difficult to comprehend, ask that they repeat it or present it in another way. That's not a rude thing to ask. I'm sorry I didn't get that. Could you rephrase? Right, rephrase is a good word. Also, if you say something and feel that they may not have understood you, be proactive and rephrase. Right? Goes both ways. And then finally, don't critique the way others speak the language. It's unacceptable to try and goad someone into speaking it another way. Unless they truly say something that any English speaker would interpret as offensive, remember that reading into what they wrote is a you thing and not a them thing. I think the important point there is it's unacceptable to try and goad someone into speaking it another way. The way that they speak is the way that they learned, and you are not their teacher. We have to be on an even playing field, and if we want to impose on them that they should speak like us in order for you to take them seriously, that's your language bias rearing up. All right, now we're going to open up for a Q&A. And while you guys think about your questions, you can open up your mics or you can drop them in the chat. And please feel free to do so. I'm going to talk about 1eXp for a second. So 1eXp is our collection of resource groups that are offered by eXp. These resource groups are founded, led, and operated by volunteers that represent both agents and staff. You can join any one of these groups by checking out their respective workplace groups or visiting the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion DEI workplace group to see a comprehensive list of the groups and their leaders. We also have the list of all the groups over on your right-hand wall that you can check out right in here in this auditorium. Opportunities include leadership roles, specific event leadership roles, pillar leadership, event volunteers, general membership, and more. All it takes is raising your hand. We currently are really looking for staff liaisons. In 2023, we're really excited to get staff more involved in 1eXp. And part of that is going to be growing out an employee arm of each of our 1eXp resource groups so that they can operate in a dual purpose way to still be agent-centric, but also operate as an employee resource group, which all the major companies in the world have, and we should have. Right now, we need staff liaisons for the Seniors Network, the Asian Network, the South Asian Network, the Middle East Network, the Military Network, eXp Latino, and the Black eXp Network, better known as BEN. We're also in need of a co-chair for eXp Middle East. If you or anyone you know might be interested, send them over to me, or you can email dei@exprealty.net. We also make all of our eXp DEI training sessions available to schedule for any team size or any individual. If any of these trainings feel like they would be relevant for you or for your team, I'm happy to put them on the calendar to come and teach them to you right in person. Just email dei@exprealty.net for more. Lastly, we would ask that if you enjoyed this content, we have a special QR code that will help you leave a review on Glassdoor and call out our DEI efforts and let us know what you think about them. Our commitment is continually to review this feedback and identify patterns and trends and celebrate our success and drive change where needed. So with that all being said, anybody got any questions about the content of the presentation today? Any scenarios where you've had a tough time communicating with someone who speaks English as a second language? Or if there's anybody in the audience that speaks English as a second language, somewhere you've been frustrated when talking to a native English speaker? See my DEI coordinator, Janae, is out there in the audience. Hey, Janae.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Anything you'd like to add about the presentation?
No, I think you did a really good job. There was something that Alex's comment triggered for me, and I meant to write it down, but I forgot it. It was on one of the, it was just basically along the lines of kind of the best way to navigate situations with people who speak ESL. I know sometimes they may be hesitant to translate a particular word for a person in their native language just because they don't want to be looked at all the time as like cultural guide or navigators. And I know that then you can become discouraged and ask other individuals, please don't. Just know that in you wanting to learn and expand your knowledge, they may also be tired of having to navigate most complex. And just to always just keep that same essence of like patience
Right.
as you try.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
it.
that's a really good point. Yeah, we got a great comment here too. I'll also add that it's good to mind how fast you're speaking to ESL clients as well. That's when we're talking about the using your actual voice. You have to be careful of how fast you speak. There's some of us from different areas of the country, in particular, that speak way too fast. Or those of us who, like me, come from the South and speak fast because I got tired of how slow everybody talks in the South, and I don't have time to wait. So I developed this fast speaking habit. Um, I have to always tell myself to slow down my speech because when I rehearse a presentation like this with just me and no feedback and no ad libs, it's like a 10-minute presentation, right? Slow down. That's a really good point. Well, if anybody thinks of any other questions or you have any suggestions about how we could make this presentation better, or if you have any suggestions for training that you would like to see, please come and find us. You can reach me, Cody Gilkison. I'm on Workplace Chat. I'm always available. I'm one of those salary employees, so I always got my chat with me. You can also email us at dei@exprealty.net. I just want to take a minute to thank everybody for coming here and participating today. Really hope you enjoyed this one. It was a labor of love to get through, but I really liked this presentation. I hope you guys did too. All right, with that, we will wrap it up. Oh, you're very welcome.